come out to the ranch. It's only a few miles. I'd rest easier knowing you were looked after.
If it's no trouble, I'd be grateful for the kindness.
The train roared westward, through the high plains like a black iron beast, chasing the Sunday smoke streamed behind it in long gray ribbons that scattered across the endless Montana sky. Inside the last passenger car, Evelyn Carter sat with her hands folded tightly around a worn leather valise and tried not to look out the window. Every mile carried her farther from the world. She'd known the cobblestone streets of Boston, the sound of church bells, the smell of rain on brick, and deeper into a land she could barely imagine. The other women in the car murmured quietly among themselves. There were 5 of them, all mail-order brides, all traveling west to meet men they had never seen. Each clutched a photograph, or a folded letter, like a talisman against uncertainty. Every so often, someone laughed too loud, brittle with nerves. Evelyn didn't join in. Her own letter lay open in her lap, the paper softened by weeks of rereading. My dearest Miss Carter, I look forward to building a home with you here in Willow Creek. Life on a ranch is hard, but there is joy in honest work and peace in wide skies. I have a small house by the river and more cattle than one man can tend. Come west and together we'll make something lasting. Thomas Hale. She had memorized every word long before the train left Boston. Thomas's letters had been steady, gentle, written in a hand that suggested patience rather than passion. That had been enough. After 10 years of teaching school and boarding in cramped rooms, where she was forever Miss Carter, she wanted a name that was hers, a roof that didn't belong to someone else's kindness, a life she could shape with her own hands. The advertisements in the Boston Gazette had promised that possibility good men seek wives for ranch life. Honest women of strong character encouraged to reply. When the whistle shrieked and the wheels began to slow, the women stirred, smoothing their dresses, pinning stray curls. Willow Creek last stop, the conductor called his voice, echoing down the narrow car. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She gathered her gloves, her hat, her single trunk, and stepped down onto the platform, into a wave of dry heat and blinding light. The station was hardly more than a wooden shed and a water tower. A few wagons waited nearby, horses stamping against the flies. Dust hung in the air so thick she could taste it. The other brides were claimed one by one, a farmer's wife, to be with tears of relief as she met her husband, a laughing girl swept into a man's arms. Within minutes, the platform was nearly empty. Evelyn shaded her eyes and scanned the crowd. Mr. Thomas Hale, she called, feeling foolish, as her voice vanished into the wide silence. No one answered. Only a boy unloading crates from the freight car glanced at her, then went back to work. She waited. 10 minutes, 20. The train pulled away, shrinking toward the horizon until even the smoke disappeared. The sun climbed higher, pressing down until sweat gathered beneath her collar. Her trunk stood beside her like a monument to misplaced faith. A man in a dusty brown coat approached from the telegraph office. He held an envelope, his expression uncertain. "Ma'am," he said, "are you Miss Carter, come from Boston?" "Yes." She managed her throat dry. "I'm to meet Mr. Hale. Has he—" He hesitated. "This came for you this morning." He offered the envelope already torn open as if someone else had read it first. "I'm sorry." Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the single sheet. "Miss Carter, there has been an accident. My brother Thomas was thrown from his horse while driving cattle across Red Willow Creek. He did not survive. I regret that I must deliver such news to a stranger, but I felt you had a right to know. If you have already begun your journey west, please present yourself at the Hale Ranch, and I will see that you are provided for until you can return east. Jacob Hale." The paper slipped from her hands. For a long moment, she simply stood there staring at nothing, the words echoing in her head. He did not survive. The man she had agreed to marry, the man whose letters she had read by lamplight, whose handwriting she could trace in her sleep, gone before she ever saw his face. The telegraph clerk shifted uneasily. "I'm real sorry, ma'am. There's a stage back east day after tomorrow. If you've nowhere to stay, the hotel—" "Thank you," she said quickly, cutting him off before her voice broke. I'll think of something." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving her alone on the empty platform. The silence pressed around her, broken only by the lazy creak of the signboard and the distant lowing of cattle. For the first time since leaving Boston, fear reached her sharp and cold beneath the July Sunday. She gathered the letter, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her reticule, as if order might hold her world together. Then she picked up her trunk, took a few uncertain steps toward the dirt road that led away from the station, and stopped. She had no idea which way to go. A gust of wind kicked up, carrying the scent of sage and smoke. In the distance, a rider approached, a dark shape against the shimmer of heat. He came at an easy lope, the movement of horse and man so fluid they seemed carved from the same motion. When he reached the station, he slowed, swung down, and removed his hat. He was tall, broad-shouldered, sun brown to the color of old oak. Lines at the corners of his eyes suggested years of squinting against wind and glare rather than age itself. "Miss Carter?" he asked. "Yes," she said, wary. "I'm Jacob Hale." His voice was low, steady, the kind that didn't need to rise to be heard. "You got my letter?" She nodded. "A few minutes ago." He studied her face, then glanced at the trunk beside her. "You've come a long way." "I have." The words tasted bitter. "And I suppose I came too late." He replaced his hat, eyes shadowed beneath the brim. "Thomas talked about you often in his letters. Said you had courage. I didn't expect you'd actually come all this way." "Neither did I," she said softly. For a moment neither spoke. Then he cleared his throat. "There's no train east until Friday. You can stay in town, the hotel's decent enough, or you can come out to the ranch. It's only a few miles. I'd feel better knowing you were looked after." Evelyn hesitated. The idea of following a stranger into the open country made her stomach knot, yet the thought of staying in this dusty town alone, with her shame and curiosity, was worse. "If it's no trouble," she said finally, "I'd be grateful for the kindness." "No trouble," he said. Thomas would have wanted it. He lifted her trunk, as though it weighed nothing, and tied it behind his saddle. Then he offered his hand to help her mount. His palm was rough, warm, steady, the first solid thing she had felt in hours. She swung up behind him, careful to keep space between them, and he clicked to the horse. They rode out of the station yard, the sound of hooves dull on packed dirt. The land unfolded in every direction, vast and merciless. Sagebrush dotted the hills, their silver leaves flashing in the light. In the distance, mountains rose pale blue and sharp as cut glass. The wind carried the scent of pine from somewhere unseen. Evelyn tried to speak once, but the words dried in her throat. There was nothing to say that wouldn't sound foolish. After a while, Jacob glanced back. "You'll find it quiet here," he said. "Sometimes too quiet." "I'm used to noise," she admitted. "The city never stops talking." He smiled faintly. "Out here, silence tells its own stories. You just have to listen different." They rode for nearly an hour before the ranch came into view, a small cluster of buildings nestled in a shallow valley, a barn, a corral, a whitewashed house, with a porch facing west. Even from a distance, she could see signs of disrepair, sagging fences, a roof in need of shingles. Yet something about the place felt solid, like a man who had weathered storms and chosen to stand anyway. Jacob dismounted first, then helped her down. "Welcome to the Hale Ranch," he said quietly. "What's left of it?" She followed him up the porch steps. The air smelled of dust and sun-baked wood. Inside the house was neat but bare furniture, built for function, not comfort. A faded quilt hung on one wall, the only sign of a woman's touch. "I can put you in the spare room," he said, setting her trunk down. "It was my mother's once. I'll sleep out in the barn tonight, give you privacy." "That's not necessary. It's courtesy," he interrupted gently. "You'll want to wash and rest. Supper's at 7. There's water in the basin." Evelyn nodded, uncertain what else to say. When he left the door, closing softly behind him, the silence filled the room like breath held too long. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands together until they stopped shaking. Through the window she could see the yard, the corral, the horse grazing beyond the fence. Jacob moved with unhurried precision, tending to the animals, checking the gate. The setting sun turned his figure to gold against the horizon. Watching him, Evelyn felt an ache she couldn't name. Not desire. Not yet, but the weight of two strangers, tethered by grief neither had chosen. That night, she couldn't sleep. The walls creaked in the wind, and the far-off cry of coyotes echoed through the valley. She lay awake staring at the ceiling beams, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of this new world. Once in the small hours, she thought she heard footsteps on the porch. Then the soft murmur of a man's voice. A prayer, maybe, or a memory spoken aloud. She didn't move. When dawn came gray and cool, she rose and washed her face in the basin. Her reflection in the cracked mirror startled her, the dust-streaked cheeks, the tired eyes. She looked less like a bride and more like someone who had crossed a desert to find herself. Downstairs, the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen. Jacob was already at the table, his hair damp from the well sleeves rolled. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She poured herself a cup, grateful for something to do. The coffee was strong enough to burn away sleep. He studied her for a moment. "You can stay here as long as you need, until you decide what comes next." "What comes next?" she repeated quietly, as if the words themselves might hold an answer. Then almost to herself, "I thought I knew." Jacob nodded, as if he understood more than she'd said. "The West has a way of changing plans. Maybe it's not what you expected, but sometimes the wrong road still gets you home." Outside, the morning light spread over the fields, turning the wet grass to silver. Evelyn stepped to the doorway, feeling the cool air on her face. For the first time since Boston, she took a full breath. Somewhere behind her, Jacob set down his cup. "I'll be in the north pasture," he said. "If you need anything, I'll manage," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. He smiled, faintly touched the brim of his hat, and left. Evelyn watched him ride away until the figure of horse and man became a dark speck against the pale horizon. Then she turned back into the house, the quiet pressing close again. Not as emptiness this time, but as possibility. She opened her trunk, laid out her few dresses, and began to sweep the floor. It was absurd, maybe, but the simple act steadied her. If she was to wait for a train, for a decision, for the shape of her new life, she would at least do it standing. Outside, the wind rose, carrying the faint scent of rain from the mountain's promise, or warning, she couldn't tell. But she listened to it all the same. The morning spread itself slowly over the Hale place, pale light pooling along the porch boards, lifting the shadows that clung under eaves and fence rails. By the time the sun climbed to the height of a man's hand, Evelyn had swept the main room twice and shaken the dust from a faded rug whose pattern only revealed itself when the grit let go. The work steadied her. Broom, pan, bucket cloth, things with edges and purposes. Things that held when the mind would not. She found a stoneware pitcher by the basin and carried it out to the pump. The handle was stiff at first, then gave with a groan. Cold water broke into the morning like a laugh. She filled the pitcher, then filled it again, rinsing the cup and the coffee pot, letting the rush and clatter drown the memory of train wheels in her ears. When Jacob came back from the north pasture, he brought the smell of sun-warmed sage and horse into the kitchen. He set his hat on the peg by the door and washed his hands without a word, sleeves darkening to the elbow where water caught and held. "I was looking for sugar," Evelyn said, surprised at how easily her voice made sound now that someone was here to catch it. "Found the tin in the second cupboard." "Is that where you keep it? Used to be?" He dried his hands on a flour sack towel. "Thomas did most of the putting away. He liked order, though you wouldn't have known it by his handwriting." "His letters were neat enough," she said, before she could stop herself. He studied the coffee pot, then set it on the stove and lit the fire. He tried hard for neatness, Jacob said. It didn't always come natural. They ate quietly, bread warmed on the stove's edge, late spring honey that tasted thin, and floral coffee that could hold up a spoon. Silence wasn't empty with him. It had weight and shape like a wool blanket pulled over cold bone. When the plates were set aside, Jacob leaned back, the chair creaking familiarly under him. "You can stay here as long as you like," he said, picking up the thread he'd laid down before riding out. "There's work enough for any pair of hands. I can't pay a wage, not till after the fall drive, but you won't go hungry. If you'd rather town, well, I can settle you at the hotel and see you safe to the Friday stage." Evelyn folded the towel she'd been worrying, unfolding and refolding it until it sat square on the table. "I'll work," she said. "It helps to do something that answers back." He nodded as if that made perfect sense. "Then we'll call it room and board for whatever you care to put your hands to." The north fence is mean as sin, the roof wants mending, and there's a garden in back that's forgot its manner. But you don't have to, I would like to, she said more sharply than she intended. The doing will keep me from looking behind. He tipped his head apology in the small movement. All right. They fell into a rhythm without talking much about it. Jacob carried a ladder from the barn and checked the missing shingles. Evelyn hauled a pail and a rag and ran a damp path over the mantel shelf and the window sills and the long table that bore scuffs like initials. She opened windows and let the day into the rooms a sweet draught that smelled of cottonwood and river stones. In a drawer, she found a stack of ladies' magazines 3 years old, their corners softened. She set them back, just as she'd found them, the way one touches the edge of a grave marker and steps away. By noon, the sky had gathered thin white clouds, the kind that seemed painted there and would not do harm. Jacob came in from the yard with a coil of fence wire and a long-handled hammer. I'll ride to the post and fetch flour if you've a mind to bake. The last sack crawled. He grimaced. Should have stored it better. I can be back before sundown. I can make do with whatever is here, she said. But bread, yes. Bread would make the house feel less like a place between places. He stood with his hand on the door latch, as if listening to the words beneath her words. I'll bring flour, he said. He was halfway to the barn when he turned back. You can lock the doors, he added the sentences, careful, as if he were laying a plank bridge board by board. There's a key for the front in that blue bowl. Back door sticks, takes a push. I won't come in without calling first. If anyone rides up, you aren't expecting you take the rifle from behind the stove and work the lever once. It's loaded. Don't point it at anything you're not willing to put a hole through. I've never... She looked past him, toward the stove, toward the places her life had not had room for. I've never held one. Let me show you before I go, he said. He crossed the room without haste, as if approaching something skittish. He set the rifle across his palms as a churchman might offer a hymnal. Like this. Hand here. Finger off the trigger till you mean it. He showed her the sights, the weight, the way the lever wanted to move and did not want to be forced. When he placed the stock against her shoulder, the wood was cool and steady and surprisingly kind. Just in case, Jacob said, the world's mostly better than we think, but now and then it asks us to answer different. She breathed in and let the smell of oil and walnut and iron fix itself where fear had been. I don't want to use it. I don't want you to either. He took the rifle back and set it with casual precision against the wall. But wanting won't always keep a thing from coming round. After he left the house, held its breath for a while, then began to speak in the small voices of Noonfly at the window. A drip somewhere in the back room, a rope on a hook, whispering as the wind passed. Evelyn found flour in the bin after all the crawling had been contained, sifted and measured and worked water and salt and yeast into a dough that pushed back under her hand. She set it to rise in the warmest spot she could find near the stove, then went to the back step to look at the garden. It had not simply been neglected, it had been left to tell its own tale. Stalks dry as old bones rattled when the breeze shouldered past. Nettles had bullied their way into the paths, and a rank sweetness rose from a corner where squash had run wild and fallen in on itself. But underneath the mess, she could see the bones of Rose, the faint memory of order. She rolled up her sleeves. She worked until the dough needed her again. She worked until her palms were tender, and the shovel's handle had made a blister bloom along the heel of her hand. She pulled the worst of the weeds and piled them for burning. She combed the soil loose around what might yet live. She gathered a handful of green beans that had miraculously strung themselves along a half-fallen plank. When she went back inside, the kitchen smelled like memory yeast and heat and the promise that something could be made from almost nothing. She slid the loaves into the oven and sat at the little table with Thomas's last letter. She had put it away, promised herself her eyes would not go there again, and still her hands betrayed her. She read it from the beginning like a penitent, reciting a prayer, a small house by the river. More cattle than one man can tend, joy in honest work and peace in wide skies. When she reached the end, she did not cry. The air in the room was too dry for tears. By late afternoon, clouds had built into something more convincing. The wind came down the draw, a little sharper, tugging the wash she had strung along the line. Evelyn brought the shirts in, and folded them still, warm the smell of sun trapped in the cloth. She set them on a chair by the door and stood for a moment listening. Somewhere far off, a coyote sang a single unsure note and was quiet. Hoofbeats broke the distance. She stepped to the porch as Jacob turned into the yard, a grain sack tied behind his saddle, a second horse on a lead. He looked tired around the eyes in a way the rest of him didn't show. Flour, and a few other things that asked to come along, he said, swinging down. George Morrison said to tell you, his wife makes a lemon pie that could set a man right with his God. I told him you'd set this house right quicker than any pie could manage. Evelyn smiled before she meant to. There's bread, she said, and beans if you don't mind. The garden picking which ones were ready. He untied the sack and shouldered it easily. I've never said no to a bean that volunteered. They ate on the porch because the breeze had turned warm again and the world was doing its best to pretend it had never meant rain. The bread cracked under their knives and let out a soft breath. Jacob closed his eyes for a second, a small grace, some men reserve for church. Haven't smelled that here in a long time, he said. Bread is stubborn, she said. It insists on rising even when a person does not. He looked at her then with a kind of quiet attention that made her want to stand straighter and look away at the same time. You sound like you've had practice at that. Yes, she said. The word was simple. She left it there. Evening came down tier by tier, a purpled light gathering in the low places. Jacob told her about the north fence, how the posts had heaved with the spring's last freeze, and would not sit true no matter the curse a man set upon them. She told him about children who could not keep their letters straight unless she set them to music, about a boy in Boston who drew ships in the margins of his arithmetic and became a sailor before his sums ever learned to add clean. The first star pricked through, then a second. Somewhere out past the barn something moved in the grass with intention. The mare in the corral lifted her head and blew softly. Jacob rose without hurry, took the rifle from where it leaned just inside the door, and stepped down into the yard. Evelyn stood as well, though she didn't follow. He stopped 10 paces from the porch and listened with his whole body, the way animals do when they mean to live. A shape detached itself from shadow near the chicken, run low, clever, unembarrassed by hunger. Jacob worked the lever once, the sound sharp as a snapped twig, and the coyote decided it was not the night to argue theology. It flowed back into the grass and was gone. Jacob lowered the rifle and waited a beat longer, as if to make sure the night understood the message. See, he said lightly as he came back up, mostly better than we think, but now and then. I heard only the part that says, now and then. She said, the last of her smile taking its time. He leaned the rifle inside. If something comes again, you wake me, he said, even if you're sure it's nothing. Especially then. They washed the plates together in a silence that didn't scrape. When the dishes stood in their places like obedient children, Jacob brought a small lamp and set it on the table. The glow made a fragile island of gold in the room. There's something I should tell you, he said. He spoke without preamble, the way some men walk into rivers. About Thomas. He was older by 2 years. He liked people. People liked him back. He wrote the letters because he believed a thing could be spoken into being if a man took enough care with his words. I didn't. He shook his head, mouth tugging at one corner. Words aren't my best work. I use them careful and hope they hold. He asked me not to answer, said I'd scare you off with straight talk and short sentences. You haven't, she said. You came despite the letters, he corrected gently. Not because of me. I wasn't meant to be at the station when you stepped off the train. I wasn't meant to be in any of this. None of us meant it. She said the truth, plain and heavy as a loaf set to rise. He looked at her hands resting on the braided mat. If you stay a week or two, I'll see you provisioned east. If you stay a season, I'll find the room inside my head to abide it. If you stay longer. He stopped as if the porch boards might give way under too much weight. We don't owe each other more than kindness, he finished finally. But there's a kind of kindness that builds a roof, and I won't turn away from that if it comes. She did not answer because there was something in the air between his last sentence and her next breath that felt like a wire drawn tight. She would not be the one to pluck it. Later, she took the lamp to the small room and set it on the table, then turned the key in the lock. The click sounded louder than it should have. She stood with her hand on the knob for a long moment, listening for the sound of his steps in the main room, the scrape of a chair, the soft thud of a man walking into his own silence. When she blew out the flame, the darkness came at once like a coat thrown around a person who didn't ask for warmth and needed it anyway. Sometime after midnight, wind woke her. The house made old house complaints, joints grumbling. She lay still, counting heartbeats, until her body remembered itself. Then she rose and crossed to the window. The yard was a chalk drawing under the moon. In the barn, a lantern burned low, a small orange eye. The door stood open a crack. She pulled a shawl about her shoulders, and then, after a second's argument with herself, unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway. The front room was full of a quiet she had not yet learned to name. She moved to the porch without creaking a board, and stood just beyond the doorframe, wrapped in cool air. From the barn came the murmur of Jacob's voice, too low for words, the rhythm of someone telling something to an animal or a ghost. She thought of the line in his letter, "I have more cattle than one man can tend," and felt suddenly and completely the meaning of more. She went back to bed and slept a little. When she woke, dawn was thinking of beginning. She dressed, braided her hair without a mirror, and lit the stove. As the iron warmed and the first thin heat rose, she took down paper and pen from her trunk and began a letter. Not to Boston. The rooms she had lived in there did not have space for the person she felt forming at the edges of this day, but to no one in particular. She wrote to the idea of a woman who might sit one day on a train heading west, hands tied over a valise, trying not to look out the window. "Do not marry safety," she wrote, surprising herself with the firmness of it. "Marry kindness. Safety is a room that shrinks to fit your fear. Kindness is a door that holds when the wind comes down the draw." She sanded the ink and folded the page, and did not sign it. Footsteps crossed the yard. She turned bacon in the skillet just as the latch lifted. Jacob waited on the threshold and called, "Coming in," before he stepped through. He'd shaved, and the raw line of his jaw made him look both younger and more tired. He stopped short at the smell. If bread made it a house, bacon made it a kingdom. "Coffee's on," she said. "I hope you like your eggs as they come, because I haven't learned what this stove means by hot yet. That'll be fine." He took a seat but didn't reach for the plate. He looked at her the way a man looks at the weather, reading what he can and forgiving what he can't. "There's talk," he said at last. "There's always talk in a town with more sky than company. Some will say a man ought not bring a woman to his place unless he means to keep her. Some will say a woman ought not stay unless she means to be kept. We won't answer either." "I wasn't planning to," she said, and set the eggs down like a flag planted. They ate. When they were done, he pushed his chair back and took the ledger from the shelf above the fireplace. The book had weight. He set it on the table and opened it to a blank page, dipped the pen, hesitated, then wrote, slow, careful, forming each letter as if it were a fence post that had to sit true. Evelyn pretended to study the stove, then gave up pretending. "What are you writing?" she asked. He didn't look up. "A list of what the place owes and what it owns," he said. "Same as most mornings." He paused, pen hovering. "And a letter." To whom he took a breath, let it out. "To Reverend Matthews, and maybe to no one if it reads wrong when I'm finished." Her hand found the back of a chair and rested there. A letter about what he capped the ink. About how a house stops being a place a man sleeps and starts being a place he lives, he said simply. About what's owed when someone lights a lamp and bakes bread and opens a window where the air was stale. Outside, the first bird cleared its throat and tried a note. Wind moved the cottonwoods like a slow hand passing over a field of heads bowed in prayer. Jacob folded the paper but did not seal it. He left it on the edge of the ledger as if a gust might claim it and decide for him. "I'll ride to the lower pasture," he said, standing. "The cattle found a hole in the fence that wasn't there yesterday. Time has a way of making liars of men who think they measured right. You'll be all right here." "Yes," she said, and she knew as the word left her mouth that it was true. All right did not mean unafraid. It meant she had her hands on something that pushed back in a way that let a person know where she stood. He took his hat and paused. "If the clouds make good on their promise," he said, "and the rain comes hard, shut the shutters on the west side. The latches stick. Use your shoulder. Sometimes a thing gives because you ask. Sometimes because you won't stop asking. He was halfway through the door when he turned. Thank you, he added. For what? For making the house sound like itself again. When he was gone, she lifted the letter he had left and did not read it. She only weighed it in her palm, feeling the balance of ink and paper and the small bright risk of a man making plans where grief had been living. She set it down and went to the window and watched the day take hold of the land the way a hand takes hold of a friend's arm, gentle, firm, with promise. By afternoon, thunder shouldered up over the far ridges and rain came as he'd said it might, sudden, certain, flung hard from a sky that could not make peace with itself. Evelyn ran from window to window, slamming shutters, breathing hard, laughing despite herself, when one finally gave under her shoulder and closed with a satisfying thud. The house darkened and warmed, and the sound of rain on the roof was a drum that set a new cadence under her ribs. She stood in the door of the spare room and looked at her trunk, at the dress she'd laid out, and not put away, at the photograph she'd kept face down and did not turn over. She went back to the kitchen and pulled a pan from the hook. When Jacob came home in the blue wash that follows a hard rain, damp and clean and tired, the room smelled of stew and wet wool, and something the heart recognizes before the mind finds words. He set his hat on the peg and reached for the letter, without looking to see whether it had walked away. It hadn't. He slid it into his vest pocket like a man tucking a small stone into a place he could touch. Fence, she asked. Still there, he said. For now. Us? She asked, surprising herself with the bravado of the syllable. He glanced at the window, where rain still traced its own handwriting down the glass. Still here, he said. They ate, and the storm moved on, and the ground drank, and the sky forgave itself the shouting. When night came, it came softly. Evelyn lit the lamp and put it on the table between them, a small warm moon under a roof that had held. Jacob took the ledger down again and opened it to where the blank page had been marked by the weight of the letter. He set the book aside. Reverend Matthews can wait, he said. For what? She asked, a smile tugging where sorrow had lived. For bread tomorrow, he said. For a house to learn our names. She locked her door that night, and the click was not fear but choice. She slept like a person who had walked a long way and put her feet on wood that promised to hold. Far off in the direction of town, a dog barked twice and was quiet. Closer, a man turned once in his bed in the barn and let out a breath as if setting down a load. Rain dripped from the porch roof in a slow metronome. On the kitchen table, ink dried where a name had not yet been written. In the morning the paper would feel light as forgiveness or heavy as vow. The house waited, listening to the two steady hearts within its walls, and the slower heart of the land beyond all of them, keeping time to a storm that had already run out of things to say. The next days unfolded like cloth being shaken open after a long sleep. The smell of rain lingered in the soil, and the valley wore a green she hadn't yet seen, a softer shade that asked nothing but time. Morning light came slower gold, spilling through the clouds in cautious stripes. Each day began with the same small sounds, the creak of the pump, the slam of the barn door, the low voices of doves nesting in the rafters. Evelyn found herself falling into the rhythm as if she'd known it before. She rose before dawn, kindled the stove-set coffee to boil, then walked the yard to check what had survived the rain. The earth steamed faintly. The weeds she'd left in piles were already half turned to ash, and where her shovel had broken ground, small shoots pressed up as though eager to be claimed. That morning Jacob joined her, boots, damp from the dew-rope, looped across his shoulder. "You've declared war on that garden," he said. "I'm only trying to see who wins," she answered. The way his mouth tilted made it impossible to tell whether he smiled or not. He leaned on the fence rail, eyes traveling over the patch she had cleared. "If you keep at it, you might make the place remember what color is." "I don't mind gray," she said. "It makes green honest." He laughed, then, a sound quiet but full like water hitting stone. It startled them both. The sound made her want to say something reckless, something about how the valley had been too quiet for too long, but she bent to pull another route instead. By midday the sun pushed the coolness out of the air. Jacob brought water from the well, and they drank in turns from the dipper. The silence between them was less about distance now, more about ease. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone reaching for a bridge already half built. "You said in Boston you taught children. You miss it sometimes," she said. "The part where they believed the world was big enough for all the letters they didn't know yet. The rest," rules Ledger's men who think teaching belongs to fathers instead of daughters, know. He nodded slowly. "Out here, a thing's worth tends to speak for itself. Doesn't mean folks always listen, but the land doesn't lie." That afternoon he brought one of the mares from the corral, a gentle bay with a white blaze down her face. "You'll need to ride if you stay," he said. "Town's too far to walk, and a horse minds better than a stagecoach." Evelyn hesitated. "I've only ever ridden the kind that goes in circles for coin on a Sunday fair. This one goes in circles too," he said. "They just happen to be larger." He showed her how to fit the bridle, how to keep her heels light and her back straight. When she took the reins, her pulse beat in her wrists. The mare shifted, once uncertain, then settled. Jacob walked beside her, one hand near the saddle in case the world tilted. The air was full of the creak of leather, the dusty rhythm of hooves, the sweet metallic scent of sweat and Sunday. "You're doing fine," he said. "She knows when you mean what you ask. And if I don't, then she throws you and we start again." Evelyn laughed. The sound came from somewhere she hadn't used in months. For a second she forgot Boston and letters and loss. She was simply a woman on a horse in air too wide to measure. When evening came, they turned the animals into the far pasture and walked back to the house side by side. The horizon burned copper, a thin line between day and night. Smoke rose from the chimney, her bread warming again for supper. Inside, Jacob lit the lamp and coaxed the fire until it caught. "Wind's turning," he said. "We'll get another storm before long." Evelyn handed him a cup of coffee and settled opposite. Shadows moved across the walls in slow patterns. The fire made the small room feel larger, safer. "I've been thinking," she said, tracing the rim of her cup, "about what you said, the West changing plans. Maybe it doesn't change them so much as show what was already wrong with the old ones." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it just gives us too much sky to hide behind excuses." She smiled faintly. "You should write that down. The preacher in Boston would have called it a sermon." "Then I'd best not," he said. "I've never had luck with pulpits. The land's sermon enough if a man listens." The rain began as a whisper. It tapped the roof once, then again, until the sound grew steady like breath. Lightning flashed beyond the windows, bleaching the walls white. The wind leaned against the house. Jacob went to fasten the shutters. Evelyn followed with the lantern. A loose board snapped in the gust, and she reached to hold it while he hammered it back. Their shoulders brushed, just a brief shock of warmth and rain. He paused long enough for her to feel his breath near her temple, then stepped back. "Thank you," he said, voice low. "Some storms come quicker than you can brace for." Inside, the fire crackled against the damp. The lantern flickered. Evelyn pulled the old quilt from the chair and spread it near the hearth. "You'll ruin the floors with those boots," she said. He looked down at them, mud-streaked halfway to the knee. "Already ruined," he said. But he took them off anyway and set them by the door. They ate their supper close to the fire, bread, beans, and a bit of smoked meat he'd saved from the drive. The thunder moved further off, leaving only the rain. The quiet that followed was almost tender. Jacob leaned forward, elbows on knees, watching the flames. The light carved the lines of his face into planes of bronze and shadow. Evelyn studied the profile, the small scar that split his eyebrow, the way the corners of his mouth held stories he'd never tell, unless asked twice. "You're thinking loud," he said without turning. "I didn't know it showed." He shrugged. "A man learns to hear quiet things when the rest of the world keeps yelling." She hesitated. "Your brother Thomas, was he much like you?" Jacob's jaw moved once before he answered. "He was the better man. Kinder. Quicker to laugh." "Then he would have liked this," she said, softly motioning around the room, the small fire, the bread on the table. The sound of people breathing under his roof again. Jacob looked at her a long time, eyes reflecting the flames. "He would have liked you," he said at last. "He liked anyone who made sense of quiet." The words hung between them like smoke. She wanted to answer, but didn't trust the air. The fire popped, sending up a small flare that drew both their eyes. Lightning flashed again, close this time. followed by a sharp crack that made the windows tremble. Then, through the rain, came another sound, a thin cry, distant but unmistakable. Jacob was already standing. That's the North Ridge. Could be cattle, could be worse. He reached for his coat. Evelyn caught his sleeve. "You can't go in this weather. Can't not." He freed his arm gently. "Stay inside. Bolt the door after me." She watched from the doorway as he crossed the yard rain, turning him to a blur of motion and mud. The lantern swung from his hand like a small, captured sundae. When he disappeared into the darkness, she shut the door and slid the bolt. The house shook, once then steadied. She knelt by the hearth and fed the fire until it steadied too. Minutes became an hour. She listened to the storm pace around the walls, the hiss of rain in the chimney. Once she thought she saw a light far off through the window, a flash, not from the sky, but from lanterns moving. She pressed her hand against the glass, whispering a prayer she couldn't finish. When the latch finally rattled, she started so hard she dropped the poker. Jacob filled the doorway, soaked to the bone, carrying a small calf in his arms. Its flank bled where barbed wire had torn it. He lowered it onto a blanket before she could speak.
Only a few miles.
It was tangled, he said, catching his breath. Would have drowned if it stayed down there. Without thinking, Evelyn fetched clean cloth hot water, the sewing kit she kept in her trunk. Between them, they worked until the bleeding stopped and the animal lay still, eyes fluttering. Jacob wiped his hands on a rag and sat back exhausted. "Thank you," he said. His voice sounded rougher than before, as if scraped by rain and smoke. "It's nothing," she said. "I've mended worse things than skin." He looked up, understanding the words she hadn't meant to say. "You have," he said. They sat in silence again, the firelight throwing long gold shapes across the walls. Outside, the storm softened to drizzle. The calf breathed slow and deep between them, a fragile heartbeat the house could hear. When Jacob finally rose, the floorboards creaked under his weight. "You should rest," he said. "Tomorrow we'll start early." Evelyn nodded, though she knew sleep would take its time. She stood, hesitated, then reached out to touch his sleeve just enough to stop him for a heartbeat. "Be careful next time," she said. He met her eyes, and something unspoken, past gratitude perhaps, or the first flicker of trust that wanted to become more. "I'll try," he said, "though the land listens to no one for long." When he left, the room felt too large. Evelyn added wood to the fire and sat until it burned low. Her palms still smelled of wet hide and smoke. Outside, the wind had changed direction. She could hear it moving through the cottonwoods like a hymn too old to remember the words. Later, when she climbed into bed, she left the door unlatched, not from carelessness or hope, but because for the first time since arriving, the silence of the house no longer frightened her. It sounded like a pause, not an absence. She dreamed of the garden in daylight, the weeds, gone rose straight flowers opening among the bean. In the dream, someone stood at the gate, watching face hidden by light. She woke before she could see who it was. The fire had died down to a single coal, still burning, stubborn as breath. Outside, dawn began to pull itself over the hills again, patient, slow, certain. By late summer, the valley turned gold again. The storms had passed, leaving the land washed clean and humming under the Sunday. Grass grew tall along the fence line, and the creek behind the Hale place ran clear enough to see stones on its bottom. Evelyn had made the house hers in quiet ways. Curtains washed floors, oiled a jar of wildflowers on the table. Jacob said little about it, but every morning he set 2 cups instead of 1. The days came smooth until the morning he said, "We should go to town." She looked up from the bread she was shaping. For what flour nails oil? He hesitated. And to remind folks, "I'm still here." They rode out before noon, the wagon creaking beneath empty barrels. The road shimmered in heat, and the wind carried a dry sweetness from the cut hay. Evelyn sat beside him, bonnet shading her face, hands folded tight in her lap. The silence between them felt companionable. An old song played soft. Willow Creek lay quiet under the August sun, its main street lined with dust and expectation. A few men stood outside the saloon, squinting toward the Hale wagon. Had always meant business, not gossip, but now, with a woman in the seat, it meant both. Jacob reined in near the general store. "Stay close," he murmured. These folks can't help measuring what they don't understand. Evelyn smiled faintly. Then let them measure. I've been weighed before. Inside George Morrison, the storekeeper looked up from his counter and broke into a grin. Hale thought the coyotes had carried you off. And this must be the lady who saved your fences. Miss Carter, is it, Evelyn? She said, shaking his hand. His wife Martha appeared from the back, wiping flour from her apron. Well, aren't you a sight? We've been talking about sending pie your way for weeks. Bread smells coming from that ranch again. We knew someone decent must have moved in. Evelyn laughed softly. It's just bread, Mrs. Morrison. That's exactly why it's holy, Martha replied. They talked easily for a few minutes, loading flour, sugar, and salt into sacks. Jacob bent to check the nails, and for a while, life felt simple again, until the bell over the door jingled. The voice that followed had polish and poison in equal measure. Well now, if it isn't Jacob Hale, and Miss Carter, I presume. Evelyn turned. A tall man filled the doorway, broad-shouldered, polished boots, smile too smooth to be honest. Marcus Hendricks. Jacob straightened slowly. You're a long way from your south section. Business brings me everywhere, Hendricks said, eyes sliding toward Evelyn. Word travels faster than horses. A Boston lady making herself at home in a bachelor's house. It's quite the talk. Evelyn met his gaze. It's a big country. Surely it has room for a woman without a husband. Room, perhaps, Hendricks said. But not forgiveness. People out here like their stories tidy. I could help tidy yours. Jacob stepped between them, his tone quiet but sharp. You've said enough. Hendricks's smile deepened. Easy, Hale. I came bearing civility. And a letter. He drew an envelope from his coat and set it on the counter. From Boston. Seems her landlady still owed back rent. I thought it might find her quicker if I carried it. George shifted uneasily. Martha stopped rolling her spoon between her fingers. Evelyn didn't touch the envelope. You read my mail now. It was open when I received it, he said, spreading his hands. You'll find I'm more helpful than most men would be. Helpful? She repeated. That's what you call meddling in a widow's affairs, widow. He echoed, feigning surprise. I didn't realize you'd already taken the name. I was under the impression Thomas Hale died before the vows were said. Color rose in Jacob's neck. You're standing in a house of business, Hendricks. Try to remember it. Hendricks turned his attention to him, voice lowering. We both know your brother owed me feed tools pasture rights. You can't keep running a ranch on debt and pride. Let me buy you out before the drought finishes what your stubbornness started. Not for sale, Jacob said. Everything is, Hendricks replied. Even redemption. He tipped his hat toward Evelyn again. And if you tire of rough boards and small talk, Miss Carter, there's room at my table for a lady who knows how to pour coffee without spilling it. Before Jacob could move, Martha Morrison's spoon struck the counter like a gunshot. Marcus Hendricks, you walk out of here before I forget you're somebody's son. The room froze. Hendricks looked from her to Jacob, then to Evelyn. A slow smile spread under his mustache. I do enjoy spirited company, he said. We'll speak again soon, Miss Carter. There's business between us yet. He left with a swirl of dust and heat. The bell over the door gave a final tremor and fell silent. Martha exhaled. He's a vulture dressed as a gentleman, George muttered. And he always circles where there's smoke. Evelyn stared at the unopened letter. He's not wrong about one thing, she said quietly. There is unfinished business between us. But it isn't his. Jacob took the letter, folded it once more, and dropped it into the stove's ashtray. The flame caught it fast. That's finished now. They said little on the drive home. The sky had turned pale clouds, rising high and slow like ships waiting for wind. When they reached the ridge above Red Willow Creek, Jacob pulled the wagon to a stop. From here the valley stretched wide, the grass shifting like waves under light. He'll come back, Jacob said finally. Men like Hendricks don't leave when they're beaten. They just change how they fight. Evelyn looked out across the land. Then let him come. I've spent half my life running from men who thought they owned what they couldn't understand. This time I'll stand where I am. He turned to her. You'd stay through that I came to build a life, not to borrow one, she said simply. If the world tests me, it'll find I don't break easy. Jacob's eyes softened. Thomas would have liked you." "I'd rather you did," she said, before she could stop herself. He blinked, startled. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then he smiled, a small, uneven thing that looked almost shy. "I already do." The words hung there fragile and real. Then he clicked the reins, and the horses started down the slope. By the time they reached the yard, the horizon glowed with the first burn of sunset. They unloaded in silence, flour inside nails, to the shed oil to the porch. Evelyn carried the last sack herself, dust rising around her skirts like gold powder. When she turned, Jacob was standing in the doorway watching her. "You didn't have to," he said. "I know," she replied. "That's why I did." That night she found him sitting on the porch, sharpening his knife beneath the lantern. The light caught the edge of his jaw, made the rest of him shadow. She brought 2 mugs of coffee and sat across from him. "Do you think he meant the threats?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "But Hendricks fights with paper first. Fire and gun come later. Then we prepare," she said. "You handle the fences. I'll make sure the house is worth defending." He looked at her as if weighing something heavy, then nodded. "All right, Miss Carter." "Evelyn," she corrected softly. "Evelyn," he repeated slower this time. Then it settled. The night deepened around them. Somewhere beyond the pasture, a coyote called a long, lonesome note that sounded like memory. Jacob stood and tipped his hat toward the darkness. "World's changing," he said. "But some things, some people make it worth staying in the fight." She watched him cross the yard, the lantern swinging in his hand. The wind carried the faint scent of smoke from a distant ranch, someone burning off old brush, or maybe warning of what waited in the dry hills. Evelyn breathed it in, let it sting her lungs, and felt no fear. For the first time since the train, she wasn't running toward safety or away from sorrow. She was simply here in a world that could break or bless, and she'd chosen to stand anyway. Later, lying awake in the small room, she heard hoofbeats in the distance. Not Jacob's. Too light, too fast. She rose, crossed to the window, and saw 2 riders moving along the ridge, their shapes outlined against the moon. One wore a pale hat that caught the light, Marcus Hendricks's color. He paused, looked down at the house below, then turned and rode on. Evelyn watched until they vanished. Then she went to the table, struck a match, and wrote in the margin of her brother's old Bible fire, "Always looks beautiful from far away." She closed the book and blew out the flame. Outside, the cottonwoods whispered secrets to the dark, and the Hale place stood silent, half promise, half warning. The wind came first. Not a storm wind, not yet, just the kind that carried warning. It moved through the valley like a restless hand bending the tall grass in uneasy waves. By late afternoon, the air had gone dry enough to taste sharp with the scent of pine sap and dust. The sky was still blue, but the color had turned brittle, stretched thin as old parchment. Jacob noticed before anyone else. He stood on the ridge above the pasture hand, shading his eyes, reading the horizon the way other men read scripture. A line of smoke, faint but steady, traced the edge of the northern hills. It rose straight for a moment, then began to lean, bent by the same wind, now tugging at his shirt. "Fire," he said quietly. Evelyn looked up from the garden, where she was gathering beans. Where Red Willow Creek, the dry stretch past the old mill road. He turned toward the barn. "If it's caught in the pines, the wind'll drive it straight down the draw." She dropped her basket and followed him without another word. Within minutes, the yard turned to motion. Jacob hauled buckets, rope, and shovels from the shed. Evelyn rolled blankets into tight bundles and soaked them at the pump. The air already smelled of heat, the faint bitter tang of burning resin miles away. Somewhere to the east, a hawk screamed, wings flashing white against the deepening gold of the sky. "Will you ride out?" she asked. "I have to," he said, looping the rope across his shoulder. "Red Willow runs close to half the ranches in this valley. If it jumps the creek, we'll lose everything." He looked at her, eyes steady. "I won't ask you to stay alone." "I won't be alone," she said, grabbing another bucket. "If the fire comes this way, someone has to keep the house from going up." For a moment, he seemed ready to argue, then nodded once. "If the wind turns south, wet the roof and close every shutter. Stay low if the smoke thickens." Evelyn met his gaze. "And you, I'll be back before dawn," he said. It wasn't a promise, but it was enough. He saddled Charlie, the bay gelding, and swung up into the saddle. The horse tossed its head, catching the scent of smoke. Jacob turned once toward her, the wind tugging at his hat brim. "Keep the lamp lit," he said. Then he was gone, a dark shape against the pale hills. By sunset, the northern sky glowed orange, too steady to be mistaken for dusk. The smell reached the house next, thick and sweet and terrible. Evelyn soaked every cloth she could find and laid them across the windowsills. Her hands shook, but her motions stayed sure. The air inside grew heavy and damp. Outside, the first ash flakes drifted down, tiny gray petals settling on the porch. From the ridge came the faint clang of metal, the far-off shouts of men, and the low thunder of hooves. The valley was awake, every ranch answering the same call. Evelyn worked until her arms trembled. When she paused at the door, the horizon had turned the color of copper and sparks wheeled like stars caught in a windstorm. Somewhere beyond that line of fire was Jacob. She set her jaw and kept working. Jacob reached Red Willow near dusk. The fire had already jumped the first ridge, licking at the dry grass, like an animal tasting its kill. Men and horses moved through the smoke, silhouettes, half swallowed by flame and shadow. He saw Tom Jacobson from the next ranch, overshirt tied around his face, shouting orders between coughs. "Wind shifted south," Tom yelled. "If it hits the creek, we'll lose the bridge." Jacob dismounted, hauling his soaked blankets from the packhorse. "Where do you want me, Westline?" Tom shouted. "We're cutting a break before it hits the timber." Jacob ran, the heat slamming into him like a wall. The fire's sound was a roar without rhythm, like all the wind in the world caught trying to breathe through one throat. Sparks leapt ahead of the main blaze, landing in dry grass that hissed and flared like struck matches. He worked beside the others without speaking, digging, beating, hauling water where water still mattered. The sweat on his skin turned to steam. Every breath tasted of ash. Once a burning branch crashed behind him, close enough to throw embers across his sleeve. He tore the fabric loose before it could catch. By midnight, the fire was everywhere, running in sheets across the hills, glowing underfoot, spitting sparks into the stars. Jacob's eyes stung, but he kept going. He thought of the house in the valley, the small window with the lamp he'd asked her to keep lit, and used that image like a compass. Hours blurred. Men fell back, regrouped, pushed forward again. Someone shouted that Hendricks had arrived with his crew, bringing barrels of water and wagons loaded with wet canvas. Jacob turned and saw him, a pale hat, soot-black face, shouting orders with the urgency of a man who owned too much to lose. "Get those sacks down," Hendricks yelled. "If it jumps again, it'll eat your homes before breakfast." For a moment, their eyes met across the smoke. There was no hatred there, no pride, only recognition. Two men against the same devouring thing. Then Hendricks was gone again, swallowed by firelight. Jacob lost track of time. At some point, the wind died. The flames, starved of air, began to sink and curl back on themselves. Men who'd been shouting now only coughed. The sky lightened in the east gray, giving way to dull pink. The fire had broken itself against the creek and their exhaustion. Red Willow still stood. Evelyn didn't sleep. She sat by the window all night, watching the red glow on the horizon fade and flare like a pulse. The lamp burned low beside her. When the first pale light crept across the valley, she went outside. The world smelled of smoke and wet earth. Fine ash covered everything. The porch, the rails, even her hair. It fell in silence, soft as snow. Then she heard it, the rhythm of hooves, slow, heavy. She ran to the gate just as Jacob rode into view, soot covering his face and shirt eyes red from smoke. He looked utterly spent, but alive. She ran toward him without thinking. He swung down from the saddle, and for a heartbeat, they only stood there, breathing the same scorched air. "It's out?" she asked. "For now," he said. "The north ridge is black, but the houses stand." She reached up, touched the edge of his sleeve, torn and blackened. "You burned yourself." "Just a sin," she said, smiling faintly. "You kept the house standing. We both did." He looked at her a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to say what sat behind his eyes. Then he exhaled. "When I saw the flames take the ridge, I thought I'd never see this place again. Never see you." The words landed between them like a spark that refused to die. Evelyn swallowed. "You shouldn't say things like that after a fire." It confuses gratitude for affection. He smiled, weary but sincere. Maybe I'm done confusing them. She turned away before he could see her eyes shine. You should rest, she said. There's water by the pump. He nodded and led the horse toward the barn. The morning light caught on the sweat and soot on his neck, making him look carved from the same scorched earth he'd just saved. By noon, neighbors began to arrive, faces black with ash eyes rimmed red. Tom Jacobson and his wife came with news half the north pastures were gone, but the town was safe. Hendricks had taken charge of the last smoldering edges, sending his men to dig new fire breaks. For once nobody complained. Never thought I'd see Marcus Hendricks with a shovel, Tom said, wiping his brow. Guess even pride burns when the wind's hot enough. Evelyn managed a small smile. Fire humbles everyone. When the Jacobsons left, she found Jacob by the creek, crouched beside the water. He was washing his hands, watching the black run off his skin like ink. The look on his face was unreadable. Hendricks, she asked. He stayed till the end, Jacob said quietly. Pulled 2 men out of a burning wagon himself. Whatever else he is, he's not a coward. Even men with black hearts can do right things. When they have to, she said. Jacob glanced up at her. You don't believe in enemies, do you? I believe in choices, she said. And in how they change us. He nodded slowly. You should have been a preacher. I'm already a teacher, she said. Same trade, fewer miracles. He smiled at that, just a flicker, but enough. That evening, as dusk settled over the valley, the first rain in weeks began to fall. It came softly, shyly, as if apologizing for being late. The drops hissed against the warm earth, carrying the scent of pine and soot. Evelyn stepped onto the porch and lifted her face to it, letting the cool water wash the ash from her skin. Behind her, the door creaked. Jacob stood in the frame-bandaged forearm, visible beneath a clean shirt. You'd catch cold, he said. I've been waiting for this rain since the first day I arrived, she said. Let it have me a while. He came beside her close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed. They stood in silence, watching the last embers of Red Willow smolder far to the north. When she spoke again, her voice was soft. When the fire came, I wasn't afraid. Not really. I just knew what to do, like I'd been here before. You were made for this place, he said simply. You just needed to find it. She looked at him, then really looked. The weariness carved into his face, the steadiness that still lived in his eyes. And you, Jacob Hale, what are you made for? He hesitated. Maybe for building something that lasts, even if it's just one house, one piece of land. His gaze shifted to her. Maybe 2 people if they're willing. The rain thickened, blurring the edges of the yard. She could have stepped back inside, safe from the cold, but she stayed. The space between them hummed with everything unspoken. You should rest, she said again, but her voice trembled now. So should you, he replied. For a long moment neither moved. Then he reached out and touched her hand, just a brush of fingers light as the rain. It was enough to make her heart stumble, once then steady. Tomorrow, he said the word barely audible under the patter of rain. We'll talk about what comes next. She nodded. Tomorrow. That night, the valley slept under the soft hiss of water. The fire was gone, but its shadow lingered, blackened ridges, smoke ghosts, rising from the ground. Evelyn lay awake, listening to the rain on the roof, hearing it echo Jacob's steady breathing in the next room. Outside, Red Willow steamed in the darkness, scarred but alive. And so were they. The rain didn't last. By morning, the sky had cleared to that washed-out blue that comes after a storm, beautiful in its quiet, but somehow lonelier for it. The valley steamed in places where fire had passed the earth, breathing out its grief. Smoke still hung in thin ribbons above the blackened ridges. The Hale place, though spared, smelled of wet ash and horses. Evelyn woke before dawn. She lay still for a long time, listening to the slow creak of wood, the soft breath of the world beginning again. When she finally rose, her hands ached from the day before, raw, where rope had burned her skin. She didn't mind. The pain reminded her that she had fought for something worth keeping. Jacob was already outside when she stepped onto the porch. He stood near the corral shirt sleeves, rolled, mending a section of fence scorched at the edges. His movements were slow, deliberate, each one the mark of a man who refused to let disaster define what stayed broken. You should rest, she called. He didn't turn. Can't rest when there's work. You fought fire all night. No one would blame you for taking a day. Jacob glanced up, sweat already darkening the collar of his shirt. The land doesn't take days, Evelyn. Neither do men who owe it their living. She walked down to him, the grass damp around her boots. And what do women owe it? He paused, looked at her properly this time. Same as men, I reckon. Their courage. She smiled faintly. Then I'll help. They worked side by side until the sun rose higher, patching the fence and clearing debris. The silence between them was comfortable now, broken only by the groan of wood and the low hum of the wind. Around noon the mail rider appeared at the gate, a boy barely 20, his horse splattered with mud. "Letter for Miss Evelyn Carter," he called. Evelyn frowned. For me, the boy handed over a sealed envelope, nodded to Jacob, and rode off toward the next ranch. The paper was heavy, the handwriting unfamiliar, precise, deliberate. She turned it over once, twice, then slipped it into her apron pocket. Jacob noticed. From back east. Looks like it. Going to open it. Not yet, she said quietly. Some words are better met after supper. The day stretched long and hot. By evening, the valley had settled again. Fires out, cattle calm, the smell of rain fading to memory. Jacob washed up at the pump while Evelyn cooked. The scent of stew filled the small house, mingling with the faint perfume of smoke still clinging to the walls. They ate in silence, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full of thoughts too tender to speak. When they finished, Evelyn took the letter from her pocket and turned it over in her hands. "It's from Boston," she said. "I recognize the postmark." Jacob wiped his hands and leaned back. "You don't have to read it aloud. I think I should." She broke the seal, carefully unfolding the pages. The ink had smudged slightly from travel, but the words were clear enough. "Miss Carter, I trust this letter finds you safe. Your former employer, Mrs. Hargreaves, has informed me of your absence and the matter of unsettled rent. More importantly, a gentleman from your former parish, Mr. Marcus Hendricks, has written expressing concern for your well-being. He states you are living in Montana Territory under uncertain circumstances. Should you wish to return east, I can arrange passage and a position in my cousin's household as companion to her aging mother. It is steady work with respectability and security. You are welcome, Miss Carter, to reclaim your place among civilized society. Yours sincerely, Reverend John Marin." Evelyn finished reading, folded the letter, and placed it on the table. For a long while neither spoke. "So that's what he wants," Jacob said finally. "Hendricks, he means to haul you back east, make himself look merciful while he does it." Evelyn traced the edge of the paper. "It's more than that. It's the life I left behind, calling me back like it still owns me. Do you want to go?" His voice was calm, but his hands had curled into fists. She didn't answer immediately. There's comfort in the offer. A roof, a wage, a place that makes sense to people who need the world tidy. She looked up at him. "But I'd be a ghost there. I know that now." Jacob exhaled slowly. "Then you already have your answer, maybe," she said. "But answers don't stop the ache." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Evelyn, if you're staying because you think I need you, don't. I've lived alone before." She smiled sadly. "And if I stay because I want to, that stopped him." He looked at her, really looked, and for a moment the quiet between them carried more weight than any declaration could. Finally he said, "Wanting's the one reason, that's enough." For 3 days the letter stayed on the table. Sometimes Evelyn caught herself staring at it, wondering what her life would have been had she taken the train back east months ago. A small room, polite silences, endless days that never changed. Instead, she had a rough house, with unpainted walls, a man who fixed fences by moonlight, a sky that refused to be contained. On the 4th morning, Hendricks returned. She saw him first from the porch, 2 riders, 1 pale hat, 1 shadow. He dismounted at the gate and waited, not presuming to enter. The smell of tobacco drifted on the wind. Jacob came out a moment later, wiping his hands. "You've got nerve, Hendricks." "Just a message," Hendricks said evenly. "Miss Carter received my friend's letter." "She did," Jacob said. "She burned it after reading." "That a fact?" Hendricks smiled faintly. "Then she's freer than most." Evelyn stepped down from the porch. "What do you want, Marcus?" He met her eyes. "To apologize. For Red Willow." For the words I said in town. I misjudged you." She arched an eyebrow. "And you came all this way to ease your conscience." "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe to make another offer. Not of marriage, don't worry. Just partnership. The fire ruined half my land. I'll rebuild, but I need hands I can trust. I'd pay fair wages and give you a share in the stock come spring." Jacob stiffened. "She's not for hire." Hendricks ignored him. "It's honest work, Miss Carter. You've got grit. You'd have your own cabin, your own horse. You'd answer to no one but yourself." Evelyn studied him, searching for the trick in his words, but found none. His pride had burned away with the rest of Red Willow. "Why me?" she asked quietly. "Because you stayed when most would have run," he said. "And because I've spent too long pretending money makes me whole." The wind stirred the ashes at their feet. Jacob's voice came low. "You done?" Hendricks nodded once, then tipped his hat. "Think on it. Either way, you've both got my respect. That's not something I give easy." He mounted, turned his horse, and rode off toward the Black Hills. When the dust settled, Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Strange man. Jacob's jaw worked. He'll be back. Maybe, she said. But maybe this time he won't be the villain. He didn't answer. He was staring at her like she was the fire and the rain together, something that could either save him or burn him clean through. That night she packed a small satchel. Jacob found her at the table, folding a shirt with careful hands. "You're leaving," he said. "I don't know yet," she replied. "But I need to think somewhere that isn't here." He nodded once, though his throat tightened. "Where will you go?" "Only as far as the ridge," she said. "There's a cabin up there by the old mine. I saw it when we herded cattle last month. I'll stay a few days." He stood in the doorway silent. The lamp cast his shadow long across the floor. "Evelyn," she looked up. "Don't ask me to stay tonight. I don't want to promise something I'm not sure I can keep." He swallowed. "Then just promise you'll come back." She smiled softly. "If I can." He watched her ride away in the gray light, before dawn her figure small against the vastness of the valley. The trail dust rose behind her golden in the rising Sunday. He stood there long after she vanished until the wind shifted and carried her scent away. Days passed. The world kept its rhythm fences to mend cattle, to feed storms, to read. Jacob threw himself into work, but the house felt hollow. At night he caught himself glancing at her empty chair, the lamp she'd left burning by habit. He missed the sound of her humming under her breath, the way she'd scold the kettle for boiling too fast. On the sixth evening a figure appeared on the ridge at sunset. For a moment he thought it was a trick of light. Then she dismounted and walked toward him, wind tangling her hair. "You came back," he said. "For now," she replied. The cabin was quiet. Too quiet. I could hear my own thoughts. "Dangerous things, thoughts," he said. She smiled faintly. "I decided something." He waited. "I'm not going back east," she said. "And I'm not staying because I owe anyone anything. I'm staying because this place feels like the first thing I've chosen for myself." Jacob stepped closer. "And me, you're part of it," she said softly, "but not the reason. Do you understand?" He did. And somehow that truth felt more sacred than any vow. They stood together as the sun dipped behind the mountains. The air smelled of new grass and faint smoke of endings and beginnings tangled together. Somewhere far off thunder murmured a storm building for another day. Jacob reached for her hand. She let him take it. No promises. No forever. Just two souls standing in the wide, wounded country, finding something close to peace. That night, Evelyn sat on the porch alone after Jacob had gone inside. The stars were sharp and clear, the kind that made you feel both small and infinite. She took the Boston letter from her pocket, the second copy she hadn't burned, and fed it to the fire. The paper curled, blackened, turned to nothing. When the last ember faded, she whispered, "I'm not a bride anymore. I'm a woman who stayed." And somewhere in the dark the wind carried her words away like a prayer the land would remember. Autumn leaned in early quiet, as a hand over a candle. By the 1st of September, the aspen along the draw had gone to coins, yellow flashing in the wind, then letting go all at once, soft rain of gold, against black slopes where summer's fire had left its handwriting. Green had already shouldered through the ash in seams and stitches, mending slowly, stubbornly. Cattle grazed close and wary. The creek spoke lower than it had in spring, a throat clearing before winter's long silence. The valley smelled of iron and apples, and the faraway taste of snow. Evelyn learned the season the way you learn a person, by the small, unremarkable patterns that taken together become a life. Buckets at dawn. The weight of blankets 2 nights earlier than last year. The first kettle that sang before steam showed a trick of a draft she could now name. On the Hale porch, she chalked letters for 3 neighbor children 2 afternoons a week. Thin Eli Jacobson, who counted on his fingers and then on the rails when the numbers got scared. Dina, who would not speak until the page lay clean and then read like a creek running. Little Tomas, whose boot heels never found stillness, but whose eyes did when letters turned into words. Jacob mended fences in long lines and short patches hands, sure jaw set in the way of men who accept that time is a tool and not a mercy. He rose with the cold star and came back with the first blue, bringing the leather and sun and quiet with him. In the evenings he sat at the table and watched her read Whitman again, and the psalms she swore she didn't need, but always reached for when the dark had large thoughts. Sometimes he dozed with his chair tipped back and his hat low. Sometimes he asked for one more page. They had become easy with each other, the way people do who have carried water between fires. No hurry, no debt, no explanation demanded. Still a line lived between them, a clear, honest river of choice. Not fear, not habit choice. They both honored it. They both knew where the stepping stones lay if ever they meant to cross. The world brought the test for that line on a day as clear as glass. 2 wagons rattled down out of the north at noon, leaving a thread of dust that clung to sunlight. 4 men rode with them, 3 in stiff coats that had never met a cow, one with a slouch cap and a case like a field organ. The lead man climbed down, smoothed a waxed mustache, and touched his hat to the yard as if it belonged to him already. Jacob Hale, Pratt, Northern Pacific. We're charting a spur from Helena east to the timber and the crossings. You've got the high ground we need for a clean line. Creek close by for a tower. We can talk right of way and a siding. Jacob set his hammer on the post cap as a man might lay a pistol down, muzzle out, polite but clear. How clean as God's own ruler, Pratt said, cheerful as a sales hymn. He unrolled a map that crackled with the sound paper makes when it believes it has authority. A red pencil vein cut the valley on the bias, skirting the draw, kissing the creek, angling through the north pasture like it had never belonged to anything but lines. Here's your siding. Hale has a good mouthfeel on a timetable. Evelyn came down the steps wiping flour on her apron. And what's the price of mouthfeel, mister? Pratt. $1 an acre for the strip plus. We pay materials borrowed off your edges, he said smoothly. You'll cut your haul to town to near nothing. 4 years, and you'll have a platform, a water tank, a telegraph, children beating books against their knees while they wait to be called. Progress, ma'am. And Sparks, Jacob said, gaze on the black seam of last month's burn. And strangers who think offense is a suggestion. Pratt smiled the way a man smiles at a child who's asked a true question and doesn't know it. Every blessing has a burr, Mr. Hale. We learn to live with both. Leave it to you to count. Leave your papers, Jacob said. The land and I will talk. Pratt doffed his hat, already looking past them to the ridge he meant to claim with arithmetic. Talk quick. The line moves with weather, and weather isn't patient. When the wagons rolled on, silence stayed like smoke. It felt like a church after the hymn, the air full of words that had not been said. They ate without much speaking that night. When the plates were clean, Evelyn spread the map on the table. The red line shone wrong and certain. If it comes, she said, fingertip tracing the cut through pasture, it brings lumber and seed letters, and a bell for the schoolhouse. Children won't walk 5 miles in snow to a porch when they can come to a siding. And it brings men who measure with boots what they do not own with bones, Jacob answered quiet. I've mended enough fences to know that straight lines break what curves we're holding. You didn't tell him no. I'm listening, he said simply. I'll see what the ground says in my sleep. In the morning he'd already decided a different thing. I'll take a drive north, he told her, cinching Charlie's girth and checking the lashings on the pack saddle. Fort Benton's buying deer. If I can get there before the freeze, I'll sell high enough for wire and boards. The siding is choice. The fence is need. How long, she asked. 2 weeks up with Jacobson's boy Reed and a cook 10 days back if the river minds me. If it doesn't, he shrugged in that narrow way men do when they'll wrestle current with rope and prayer and call it skill. She tucked biscuits and jerky and a paper of coffee into his saddlebag and slid the battered Whitman under the flap. For when luck needs a bribe, he took it without joking. At the gate he turned one's hand on the top rail, where her hand had been 100 morning. Keep the lamp burning. If you look back, you'll turn to stone, she said, a smile without much humor in it. I've got no use for stone. He touched the brim of his hat and rode forward, not once turning to make her spell true. Days stripped themselves to their wood. She made the house earn its keep-swept dust that came back. Grateful set jars of late beets in the cellar, scrubbed the table to the pail where Jacob's hands had darkened it. In the afternoons, she chalked letters on the porch board and watched Eli's tongue push at the corner of his mouth when sound finally shook hands with shape. Twice she walked to the school frame nearer town. 4 uprights and a ridge board Hendrick's crew had set after the fire when men wanted pennants and nails. Hendricks came himself one morning with 2 planks and a wary kind of peace in his eyes. The committee asked for lumber, he said, not quite meeting her. I said yes, if you teach them to add numbers that scare them and read words that won't. They agreed. Are you bargaining with God? She asked lightly. I'm practicing in case he takes me serious, he said, almost smiling. The siding will hurt less if it comes to something worth the noise. He left before she could answer, like a man who'd learned leaving on time is a kind of grace. The first snow tried itself and failed by noon. The second came by starlight and held in the shadows. On the 9th day, a wind slid down from the east and brought the river with it, the smell of iron and damp bark and distance. On the 10th, the lamp chimney smoked no matter how she set the wick. She took that for a sign she didn't know how to read and lit it anyway. On the 11th morning, a hat came along the lane like a dark coin tossed up and caught. Beneath it was Reed, the boy face windburnt and eyes raw with tired. He sent me ahead, Reed said, swinging down with more will than grace. Sold good. The river ran high and argued 2 days. He argued back and won. Alonzo's bringing what's left of the herd to Jacobson's. Barnes broke a hand pretending a stove is a tame thing. Mr. Hale's a day behind if the bridge plank doesn't sing wrong to the horse. Evelyn's throat went narrow. Come in, eat, tell it again slow, and put one harmless story between the dangerous ones so my mind remembers where home is. He ate stew and told about a roan that slept with its nose in the cook's lap, about a saloon cat that lived on the roof and slid down the stovepipe for warmth, about a button seller at the dock whose skirts rattled like a drawer. He slept with his boots on hat over his eyes and left before first light with a note that said only lamp bright. He's behind me. She kept the day from breaking by doing small work, slow mending one seam, until it understood washing 1 cup as if it were more counting the beats between the rooster and the Sunday. By mid-afternoon the world went to pewter. She walked to the gate because spells fail if you do not feed them. The road from the rocks that make a doorway held a shape at last. Not fast. Men return slow when they mean to stay. The horse was bay with a star spilled low. The rider was worn to bone and winter and certainty. Jacob set his hand on the top rail when he reached it and left a dark print where frost gave way. You made it, she said. I told you I would, he answered, voice gone rough and soft at once. He did not smile yet. Some smiles are, for after a man counts what remains. Wire enough. Boards enough. Choices left over. Pratt, she asked. In town. Wants ink before a week's end. He looked past her at the black seam on the ridge that the first snow had underlined. The train will bring letters and strangers and sparks. It will cut the valley open so it can heal different. And you. I'll choose what lets the land breathe and lets you stay, he said simply. And if those are not the same thing, then we wait. He said, and for the first time since he'd left, he smiled, tired, certain. A season, a storm, a line of verse. We let what's true gather itself until it's strong enough to carry. In the morning they rode to the school frame. Snow held white along the ridgeboard like a clean thought. The creek below worked at its own work, talking sense to rocks in a language no survey knew. Jacob laid Pratt's map on the sill. The red line bisected their pasture like it believed it had always been there. Evelyn placed her gloved finger where the line crossed the creek. Paper says straight. Water says bend. Paper will warp in rain, he said. Water remembers where it went and will go again. Do you want the siding, she asked, not letting tone decide for truth. I want a bell I can hear from the north pasture, he answered after a while. I want a letter from Helena that does not take a month to ride in a pocket. I want your students to track mud on a real floor, because a real floor exists. I do not want sparks and men with maps to turn my cattle into arithmetic. She listened to the wind run a hymn along the ridgeboard. Maybe we don't sign today. Maybe we make tomorrow earn it, he said. They left the map there for the weather to consider, and rode home by the long way. The one that takes you past the cottonwood, his father had bound a swing to once past the low rise where the snow first stays, past the place where Gertrude, the goat, pretended she did not hear her name, and then came running anyway because habit is a kind of love. Hendricks came at midday with a borrowed smile and a stack of slates wrapped in canvas. He kept to the gate like a man who has learned borders the hard way. The committee says, a roof by first snow, he told Evelyn. The siding would pay for boards fast, but I promised lumber either way. You've got my word. You're buying back what you burned, Jacob said, not accusing, not kind. I'm learning to name the cost, while there's still time to choose it. Hendricks answered, meeting his eyes once and then not again. To Evelyn he said, if the train comes, teach them to listen sharper than its noise. In late afternoon, Jacob saddled the bay again. I'll hear Pratt, he said. Hearing is not agreeing. If I sign, it will not be because a man smiled at a map. I'll be at the frame at dusk, she said. If there's news, we'll let the boards hear it first. He touched the brim of his hat and rode out. He didn't look back. She watched until dust gave him to distance, and then lit the lamp against a day that wanted to end too soon. Dusk stitched itself to the hills with thread the color of pewter. Snow practiced without committing. Evelyn walked to the half-built school with the map folded under her arm, Whitman in her pocket by habit. The frame stood against the sky like a question. A child had drawn EL1 with a finger on a post and rubbed it away, practicing a secret before telling. She laid the map on the sill and smoothed it. Frost found her knuckles. Her breath made a cloud like something trying to become visible. She closed her eyes and listened wind hawk the creek's patient arithmetic. Somewhere far off, a sound that could have been a train whistle if the valley had already said yes, or could have been only wind tuning itself for winter. She did not decide which. Some mercies live where uncertainty does. Steps behind, slow, familiar. She didn't turn immediately. Let the spell have its measure. When she did, Jacob was there, hat in his hand hair, gone to winter wheat eyes, the color of creek shadow. We can sign, he said. Pratt will promise 2 men to watch for sparks, and a tank for the pumpers come June. Or we can wait a year and see where the main line bends, and make our bend match the lands instead of the maps. What do you want, she asked. Because love that cannot bear an honest question is a favor, not a covenant. I want the thing that keeps you here, and the valley alive, he said. If that wants waiting, I can be patient. She put her palm on the paper. He set his beside it. 2 damp ovals darkened through the red pencil line, and then dried, leaving no mark you could hold in your hand, and every mark that mattered. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she echoed. They walked down from the frame side by side, and then at the path's fork in different directions, the distance between them no wider than the space between 2 rails that might one day run parallel towards something neither could name yet. Night came early without apology. The first true snow committed fine as sifted flour, at first, then fuller, dressing the ridgeboard in white and the rails of the porch in lace. The lamp in the hale window threw a small, stubborn circle on the yard, the kind of light you keep for someone or for yourself when you cannot say which is